The image of Nazi soldiers posing with captured women is one of the most haunting relics to survive from the Second World War. For decades, historians and the public alike have been troubled by what such photographs represented. Were they staged propaganda tools, or were they spontaneous moments that revealed the terrifying reality of life under Nazi occupation? The passage of 80 years has not erased the pain or mystery, but new research, survivor testimony, and uncovered documents have shed light on truths that were once buried beneath silence and fear. The story of these photographs is not simply about war or conquest. It is about the intersection of cruelty, humanity, survival, and the long journey of memory that continues to shape the way we understand the past. When the German army swept across Europe in the early 1940s, they left behind not only physical destruction but also countless images. German officers and ordinary soldiers carried cameras, often encouraged to document their victories for the Reich. Amid these photographs are the disturbing ones: soldiers smirking as they stand beside terrified women. Sometimes the women are villagers rounded up after an occupation, sometimes they are resistance fighters captured in raids, sometimes they are Jewish women forced into humiliating situations before deportation. In the frozen smiles of the soldiers and the hollow eyes of the women, we see the imbalance of power distilled into a single moment. To the men in uniform, it might have been a trophy, a souvenir, or a moment of false triumph. To the women, it was a photograph of their humiliation, sometimes taken hours or even minutes before death. For decades, the true stories behind many of these images were lost or deliberately hidden. Families who recognized their daughters or sisters in these photographs often stayed silent, fearing shame or reprisal during and after the war. In post-war Europe, nations were eager to rebuild, and many communities preferred silence over reliving the trauma. The women who survived carried wounds that were deeper than physical scars. They were often branded collaborators or shunned because of the complex situations into which they had been forced. Some had been coerced into serving German officers, others had been raped or brutalized. Their presence in such photographs was not their choice, but the stigma followed them long after the Nazis had been defeated. 80 years later, however, scholars and descendants of victims have begun piecing together the puzzle of these photographs. Archives once locked behind the Iron Curtain have opened, and researchers have identified the locations and the people in some of the most infamous pictures. Oral histories recorded in the late 20th century, when survivors were finally ready to speak, have matched chilling testimonies with the photographic evidence. What has emerged is a layered truth that goes far beyond the surface horror of Nazi cruelty. It is a story of women who, despite unimaginable suffering, resisted, endured, and in some cases, outlived their captors to tell the tale. One striking case involves a photograph found in a German soldier's album, showing 3 laughing Nazis posing with 2 women in torn dresses in front of a farmhouse. For decades, no one knew who the women were. Recently, researchers discovered that the photograph had been taken in Ukraine in 1942. The women were sisters, members of a local resistance group that had been betrayed. Their names were Anna and Katerina, and the picture was snapped shortly before they were transported to a makeshift camp. Anna was executed days later, while Katerina survived after being transferred to a labor camp in Germany. After the war, Katerina returned to her village, but she never spoke of what had happened. Her granddaughter only discovered the photograph in an archive 70 years later. The family finally understood why Katerina had lived with such heavy silence all her life. What had seemed like just another cruel wartime image became a deeply personal revelation about the strength and suffering of a woman they loved. Another photograph, widely circulated during the war, shows Nazi officers lounging on a bench while 3 young women sit beside them, clearly distressed. For years it was interpreted as evidence of collaboration, with the women assumed to be local girlfriends of the occupying soldiers. In fact, documents uncovered much later revealed they were prisoners, forced to sit for the camera as a grotesque demonstration of Nazi dominance. The women were not collaborators at all, but victims of coercion. 2 were later executed after being accused of aiding resistance fighters. The photograph, which had once been used to shame them in their village, became instead a testament to their courage and to the ways in which Nazi propaganda twisted reality. The shocking truth was not only that these women had suffered but that history itself had mislabeled them for decades. In studying these photographs, historians have come to understand that they were not merely casual snapshots. They were often deliberate tools of terror. German soldiers knew that images could humiliate their captives and send a message of fear to occupied populations. The very act of forcing women to stand beside their captors turned the camera into a weapon. Yet paradoxically, these same photographs have now become evidence against the perpetrators. They reveal not only who the soldiers were but also the identities of the women, their clothing, their villages, their resistance. They are silent witnesses that speak louder than any propaganda. The emergence of these truths also forces us to reconsider how war photography is interpreted. For years, the dominant narratives in many countries painted women in occupied territories with suspicion. They were often accused of fraternization, shamed with public head-shaving rituals after liberation, and excluded from official accounts of resistance. Only in recent decades have historians begun to recover the complexity of their stories. Many of the women in these photographs were victims of sexual violence, a subject long taboo in post-war societies. Others were resistance fighters captured in action, their bravery overshadowed by the humiliating images left behind. To understand the truth, we must recognize that photographs are not neutral, they reflect the power dynamics of the moment they were taken. The psychological impact on the survivors cannot be overstated. Imagine living decades knowing that somewhere, in some archive or in someone's attic, there is a photograph of you taken at your most powerless moment. Survivors often described feeling as though the image trapped them forever in that instant. It was only with the passing of time, and the growing willingness of later generations to confront the darker chapters of history, that some families began reclaiming these images. Instead of symbols of shame, they became symbols of survival and resistance. They told the world, here was a woman who suffered, but she lived, and her story matters. 80 years on, the shocking truth is not only about what the Nazis did but about how society has remembered, or misremembered, the women who endured it. The photographs are reminders of cruelty, yes, but also of resilience. They show us how easily narratives can be distorted, how victims can be mislabeled as collaborators, and how silence can bury truth for generations. They also show us the power of revisiting history with empathy and honesty. The granddaughters and great-granddaughters of these women now speak openly about what happened, refusing to allow shame to dictate memory. In doing so, they reclaim dignity for those who were once humiliated. What emerges most clearly from this long journey is that the photographs, once intended as trophies of domination, have backfired across time. They now stand as damning evidence against the perpetrators and as memorials to the courage of the victims. The Nazis could control the moment when the shutter clicked, but they could not control how the world would interpret those images generations later. Today, as historians and families work together to piece together the past, the faces of those women look back at us not only as victims but as witnesses. Their silent testimony continues to haunt us, demanding that we learn, remember, and never allow such cruelty to happen again. The shocking truth that has emerged after 80 years is both heartbreaking and inspiring. It is heartbreaking because it reveals the depth of suffering inflicted on innocent women, often erased or distorted in official accounts. It is inspiring because it shows the resilience of memory, the determination of families and scholars to uncover what was hidden, and the way in which justice can still be served, not through courts but through remembrance and truth. The photographs that once symbolized Nazi triumph now expose Nazi brutality. The women who were once humiliated are now honored. And the soldiers who once smiled smugly into the camera are remembered not as victors but as perpetrators of cruelty. In the end, the story of Nazi soldiers posing with captured women is not only a story about war but about the endurance of truth across generations. It reminds us that history is not static, it is constantly being re-examined, reinterpreted, and reclaimed. What was once propaganda has become testimony. What was once shame has become honor. And what was once silence has become a voice that speaks louder with every passing year. The faces in those photographs continue to look at us, asking us not to turn away, not to forget, and not to let their suffering fade into the shadows. In their eyes, we see both the horror of the past and the responsibility of the present. To remember them is to ensure that the truth, however long buried, will always emerge. 1. The haunting power of Nazi war photographs. The photographs of Nazi soldiers posing with captured women have become some of the most disturbing remnants of the Second World War. These images carry a chilling weight because they are not just random snapshots of history, they are moments frozen in time where domination and suffering are clearly visible. For the soldiers, the act of smiling for the camera might have felt like a trivial act or even a display of pride in their conquests, but for the women, it captured a moment of vulnerability and humiliation. These photographs have haunted generations because they reveal the human faces behind the statistics of war, exposing how cruelty was not always hidden in dark rooms or secret camps, it was often openly displayed. The haunting nature of these images lies in the way they turn ordinary soldiers into perpetrators and innocent women into unwilling symbols of Nazi power. 2. Cameras as weapons of humiliation. While guns and bombs were the obvious tools of Nazi terror, the camera also became a weapon. By forcing women to pose with them, Nazi soldiers used photography as a form of psychological violence. The act of capturing their victims in moments of distress turned private suffering into public humiliation. These photographs were often shown to comrades or kept as trophies, a way for the soldiers to boast of their dominance. For the women, the images represented a theft of dignity that would follow them even if they survived. Unlike physical wounds, which might heal, the trauma of being photographed in such degrading circumstances could last a lifetime. The Nazis understood that fear spread through more than violence, it spread through symbols, and photographs became one of the most effective ways to broadcast terror across occupied territories. The weaponization of cameras remains one of the most overlooked aspects of wartime cruelty. 3. The imbalance of power frozen in smiles and fear. Looking closely at these photographs, one cannot miss the stark contrast between the soldiers' faces and those of the women. The men often grin, smirk, or adopt casual stances as if the moment is lighthearted or even amusing. In direct opposition, the women's eyes reflect fear, despair, or resignation. This imbalance of power, captured so vividly in the imagery, reveals the very essence of Nazi occupation. The soldiers are in control, their authority backed by weapons and uniforms, while the women are stripped of choice and agency. The smiles of the soldiers become grotesque when set against the hollow expressions of the women, turning the photographs into a disturbing tableau of human cruelty. The contrast between pride and pain shows the depth of psychological warfare. These images remind us that war is not only about physical battles but about power imbalances etched onto the lives of individuals who could not fight back. 4. Hidden stories behind the photographs. For decades, the individuals in these photographs were nameless. Women who appeared in them often disappeared into history without explanation, their identities obscured by silence or destroyed records. Some were wrongly labeled as collaborators or dismissed as anonymous villagers. Others were victims of sexual violence, a subject too taboo for societies to address in the immediate post-war years. Only recently have researchers begun connecting names to faces, uncovering the hidden stories that these images represent. Families who once had no knowledge of their relatives' experiences now see them frozen in these moments of pain, and the truth becomes both devastating and illuminating. These hidden stories reveal not only personal tragedies but also how societies often fail to preserve the memory of women during war. The women were not simply props in Nazi photographs, they were individuals with lives, families, and resistance that deserve to be remembered with dignity and honor. 5. Families burdened by shame and silence. The aftermath of these photographs was not only borne by the women themselves but by their families. For many decades, survivors avoided speaking about what had happened, partly because of trauma and partly because of social judgment. In post-war Europe, where communities were eager to move forward, women who had been photographed or associated with German soldiers were often shamed, regardless of whether they had been victims or collaborators. Families sometimes chose silence over confrontation, burying the truth to protect their loved ones from stigma. Generations grew up knowing little about their mothers' or grandmothers' wartime experiences. The silence became its own kind of prison, leaving unanswered questions that weighed heavily on descendants. Only in recent years, with a greater willingness to discuss sexual violence and the complexities of wartime survival, have families begun uncovering these stories. The burden of silence is finally giving way to truth and remembrance. 6. Archives and research uncover forgotten truths. With the opening of archives in Eastern Europe and the digitization of wartime collections, historians have been able to shed new light on these photographs. What once seemed like anonymous snapshots can now be linked to specific locations, dates, and individuals. Military records, testimonies, and even Nazi soldier diaries have helped identify victims and contexts. This research has revealed that many photographs once dismissed as propaganda were actually evidence of crimes, showing resistance fighters before execution or women forced into humiliating situations. The uncovering of these truths has transformed the photographs from curiosities into vital historical documents. They are now recognized as evidence not only of Nazi brutality but also of how propaganda operated. By re-examining these archives, scholars and families alike are reclaiming narratives that had been hidden for 80 years. The process demonstrates how diligent historical research can restore dignity to the forgotten. 7. Survivor testimonies bring new light. As survivors aged, some finally chose to break their silence, sharing painful testimonies about their experiences. These accounts have been crucial in reinterpreting the photographs. What had once seemed like simple moments of soldiers posing with locals turned out, in many cases, to be moments of coercion, fear, and resistance. Survivors revealed the context behind the forced poses, the violence that occurred off camera, and the fates of those who never returned. Oral histories have allowed researchers to connect names and stories to anonymous images, turning faceless women into remembered individuals. These testimonies also highlight the resilience of the survivors, who carried their trauma for decades but eventually spoke in the hope of setting the record straight. Their voices ensure that the photographs are no longer just tools of Nazi humiliation but also instruments of justice and remembrance for future generations. 8. Case of the Ukrainian sisters, Anna and Katerina. One of the most powerful revelations involves the case of Anna and Katerina, two sisters photographed in Ukraine in 1942. The image shows them flanked by laughing German soldiers, their clothes torn and their expressions marked by fear. For years, no one knew who the women were. Eventually, researchers pieced together military records and survivor accounts, identifying them as resistance fighters betrayed by informants. Anna was executed shortly after the photograph was taken, while Katerina was deported to a German labor camp where she survived the war. After her return, Katerina never spoke of the incident, living with the memory in silence. Decades later, her granddaughter discovered the photograph in an archive, finally learning the truth. The story of the sisters symbolizes both tragedy and resilience, showing how photographs once meant to dehumanize victims can now restore identity and dignity to those who suffered in silence for generations. 9. The distortion of propaganda photographs. Many of these photographs were intentionally misleading, designed to present a false narrative of the occupation. Nazi propaganda often depicted women as willing companions or passive figures, creating an illusion of harmony between occupiers and the local population. In reality, many women were coerced, threatened, or violently abused before being forced into these staged images. The distortion of truth through photography was a deliberate act, meant to manipulate both German audiences and local communities. Decades later, this distortion has caused lasting damage, with some women remembered unfairly as collaborators when they were, in fact, victims. By revisiting these images with critical historical methods, we can strip away the propaganda and reveal the truth. Understanding this distortion helps us recognize the insidious power of visual media and the importance of questioning the narratives that oppressive regimes construct for their own gain. 10. Society's misjudgment of women during occupation. After the war ended, women who had appeared in photographs with Nazi soldiers often faced harsh judgment from their communities. In many places, women accused of collaboration were publicly humiliated, having their heads shaved in town squares as punishment. What society failed to recognize was the complexity of their situations. Some women had been forced to pose for photographs under threat of violence. Others were victims of sexual assault, coerced into relationships they did not choose. Yet post-war communities, eager to purge themselves of shame, frequently targeted women rather than the men who had collaborated politically or economically. This misjudgment not only traumatized survivors further but also distorted historical memory. Today, with greater awareness of gendered violence and coercion in wartime, historians are re-evaluating these cases. The shocking truth is that many women condemned by society were, in reality, unwilling victims caught in impossible circumstances. 11. Resistance fighters among the victims. While some of the women photographed were civilians, others were resistance fighters captured during raids. The Nazis deliberately humiliated these women by photographing them with soldiers, stripping them of their dignity before executing them. By doing so, the regime attempted to weaken local morale and deter others from joining resistance movements. Yet these photographs, once meant to humiliate, now serve as testimony to the bravery of women who fought against overwhelming odds. Identifying resistance fighters in such images has become an important part of preserving their legacy. Their inclusion reminds us that women were not merely passive victims of war but active participants in resistance, often paying with their lives. The rediscovery of these fighters' identities transforms the photographs into monuments of courage rather than symbols of defeat, ensuring that their sacrifices are remembered with the honor they deserve. 12. Sexual violence is a hidden war crime. One of the darkest truths behind many of these photographs is the reality of sexual violence. Women were often assaulted before being forced to pose with their captors. Yet, for decades, this dimension of the war was left unspoken, hidden under layers of societal shame. Victims rarely came forward, fearing judgment or disbelief. As a result, history books focused on battles and politics while ignoring the widespread suffering of women. Only in recent decades have scholars begun openly addressing sexual violence as a systematic tool of war, not an unfortunate byproduct. The photographs provide grim evidence of this crime, even if they do not show the violence directly. Understanding this hidden truth allows us to recognize the full scale of wartime atrocities. It also ensures that survivors' experiences are no longer silenced, giving voice to those who endured unimaginable violations in the shadows of history. 13. Photographs as silent witnesses. Although they were taken to glorify soldiers, the photographs have become silent witnesses to the crimes of the Nazi regime. They freeze in time the moment of domination, allowing later generations to examine what happened with clarity. Unlike written records, photographs are visceral. They show the expressions, the clothing, the environment, and the power dynamics with undeniable force. These images, when properly contextualized, serve as evidence against the perpetrators. They reveal not only who the soldiers were but also where atrocities occurred and who the victims were. As silent witnesses, they stand outside the intentions of their creators. What was once meant as proof of dominance now functions as proof of cruelty. They force us to confront the uncomfortable reality of how ordinary people could commit extraordinary crimes, reminding us that history's truth is often hidden in plain sight, waiting to be reinterpreted through the lens of justice. 14. Psychological scars of being photographed. For the women forced into these photographs, the damage went beyond the physical moment. Survivors often described feeling as though they had been trapped forever in that instant, as if their humiliation had been immortalized. The fear that the photograph could resurface in their communities only deepened their trauma. Many carried this psychological burden for decades, avoiding discussions about the war, refusing to allow photographs in their homes, or shunning conversations about the past. The idea of being objectified, reduced to an image of defeat, inflicted scars that never fully healed. Even without the photographs, the memory haunted them, but knowing that others might possess these humiliating images compounded the suffering. Understanding the psychological dimension reminds us that the cruelty of the Nazis was not only physical or political but also deeply emotional, leaving marks that shaped the rest of these women's lives long after the war ended. 15. Generational rediscovery of truth. As decades passed, it was often the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of survivors who uncovered the truth behind the photographs. By exploring archives, interviewing historians, and piecing together family histories, these younger generations reclaimed stories long buried under silence. For many families, discovering a photograph was both shocking and illuminating. It explained the unexplained silences of their elders, the unspoken trauma that shaped family dynamics. This generational rediscovery has been essential in shifting how societies view these women. Instead of seeing them through the distorted lens of propaganda, descendants now see them as victims or heroes of resistance. The younger generation's willingness to confront painful truths also reflects broader cultural changes, as societies become more open to discussing taboo topics like sexual violence and coercion. In reclaiming their ancestors' stories, families ensure that the truth is preserved, dignity is restored, and history no longer hides the suffering of the vulnerable. 16. From shame to dignity. Perhaps the most powerful transformation surrounding these photographs is the shift from shame to dignity. For years, the women in the images and their families bore the burden of humiliation, often ostracized by their own communities. Yet as research and testimonies have emerged, the narrative has changed. The photographs are no longer symbols of disgrace but of survival and resistance. Victims once shunned are now honored, their stories reframed as part of the larger struggle against oppression. This shift reflects not only historical correction but also moral reparation. Restoring dignity to these women ensures that their lives are remembered for their strength rather than their suffering. The transformation of meaning demonstrates how time and truth can change the interpretation of history. What was once intended as a permanent mark of shame has become a testament to resilience and the indomitable human spirit in the face of cruelty. 17. How memory changes interpretation. Memory is not static, it evolves with time and perspective. The photographs that once seemed to represent Nazi power have, over the decades, come to symbolize Nazi brutality instead. The same image of soldiers smiling and women suffering has a completely different meaning today than it did in 1942. This change reflects society's growth in understanding coercion, propaganda, and the complexity of war. It also highlights the importance of continually re-examining history rather than accepting surface interpretations. As new generations confront these images with fresh eyes, they bring empathy and nuance that were lacking in earlier decades. This evolution of memory ensures that history remains alive and relevant, not frozen in outdated judgments. The reinterpretation of these photographs shows that truth has a way of emerging, even after decades of distortion, and that memory itself is a powerful force for justice and reconciliation. 18. The failure of post-war societies to protect women's stories. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, much of society focused on rebuilding nations, prosecuting war criminals, and memorializing battles. Women's suffering was often sidelined or ignored. Survivors of sexual violence, coercion, or humiliation were silenced, dismissed, or even punished as collaborators. Post-war societies failed to create spaces for women to tell their stories, preferring narratives of male heroism and national victory. This failure not only hurt survivors but also distorted the historical record. Generations grew up unaware of the full scope of women's experiences during occupation. Only in the late 20th century, with the rise of feminist scholarship and survivor testimony, did these stories begin to be recognized. The photographs have become powerful evidence in correcting this failure. By acknowledging the silence of the past, modern societies can ensure that women's stories are finally given the attention and respect they always deserved. 19. The resilience of memory across decades. Despite silence, denial, and distortion, memory has a way of resurfacing. Families, historians, and survivors have worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind these photographs. The resilience of memory lies in its persistence. No matter how long it takes, the truth eventually emerges. This resilience ensures that atrocities are not forgotten, that victims are not erased, and that justice, even symbolic, is achieved. In many cases, it has taken decades for the real stories to come out, but once they do, they carry a force that cannot be ignored. The persistence of memory reflects humanity's deep need to seek justice and understanding. It also reminds us that history is not simply written once but is continually rewritten as new truths are uncovered. The resilience of memory ensures that even in the face of suppression, the past continues to speak to us across generations. 20. The ultimate reversal of propaganda's intent. The most shocking truth revealed after 80 years is how the intended meaning of these photographs has been completely overturned. For the Nazis, these images were meant to project strength, control, and superiority. Yet today, they reveal only cruelty, cowardice, and injustice. The smiling soldiers are no longer remembered as triumphant but as perpetrators of atrocities. The women, once humiliated, are now honored as victims and, in some cases, as heroes of resistance. This reversal demonstrates the power of history to reclaim narratives and dismantle propaganda. What was once a symbol of Nazi pride is now a condemnation of their brutality. This shift is the ultimate victory of truth over lies, dignity over humiliation, and justice over oppression. The photographs no longer serve the interests of the perpetrators, they serve the memory of the victims, ensuring that their suffering is never forgotten and that the lessons of history endure.